From Backcountry Magazine, this is the Backcountry Podcast. I'm Adam Howard. What's plan B for making the coal if the weather sucks in, I ask, stepping off the well-burned skin track. It's a reasonable question. So far, our plan A reads something like, go to Europe, meet several people we don't know in a small town in France, get on a tram with a week's worth of gear, and begin the 6-day haute route from Chamonix to Zermatt, Switzerland, crossing more than 20 glaciers and climbing 30,000 vertical feet. To me, it's the most iconic objective in ski mountaineering. I think plan B is to make it, Gordy Skoog says, loping past. It's 1:30 p.m. The last guided group left the Grand Montes tram station at 11 a.m. We're 2 hours off the back. No place to be on a grand tour, not one Gordy's been waiting for his whole life. Now, at the base of the Glacier du Chardonnay, we're committed, but also very, very late. And clouds are creeping down the glacier to meet us faster than we can ascend. Another member of our group, Tim Kelly, warned me about the elder of Washington's first family of mountaineering, calling him the king of Plan B, even if Plan B is Plan A. In other words, Gordy's forgotten more about traveling in glacier-strewn mountains than most of us will ever know. Don't ask about the plan. I penned this in the autumn of 2008 after a successful haute route. And I've been thinking about Gordy ever since, on and off, when Plan A becomes Plan B and vice versa. And I think today, during this pandemic we're all facing together, we all have to adopt a Plan B. And Plan B is to make it. So today on the podcast, I've brought together a group of people to discuss their Plan Bs. Joining me today via Zoom is Nick Sargent, president of SnowSports Industries America. He'll be talking a little bit about their Curb Your Turns social media campaign, essentially to get people to stop skiing. Along with Nick, Backcountry contributor Heather Hansman. She recently penned a feature about mental health in the rescue community, and I thought she'd be particularly adept at talking about the mental health challenges we're all going to face by not skiing, in addition to all the realities we face with the COVID-19 crisis. Finally, a physician from New Hampshire, Brian Irwin. He's the medical advisor for the Tuckerman Ski Patrol, an associate professor at Dartmouth Medical School. And of course, Lucy Higgins, editor-in-chief of Backcountry Magazine. We recorded this trying to put it on the Facebook Live, so we'll enter the conversation with that context in mind. Thanks for joining, and welcome to the Backcountry Podcast. We're back live with the live recording of the Backcountry Podcast that we're calling Plan B. With me today, I have Lucy Higgins, our editor-in-chief, Dr. Brian Irwin from the Mount Washington Valley. He's an assistant professor at Dartmouth University and physician and the medical advisor for the Tuckerman Ravine Patrol. I have Nick Sargent from SIA and freelancer Heather Hansman from Washington. We're trying to bring the community together today because most of us are not skiing or snowboarding. Some of us, however, are. And I'd like to start there with Lucy. Lucy, we've been covering a couple stories that are emerging right now. One, sadly, in the Tetons, it sounds like a couple snowboarders kicked off a slide yesterday on the south side of Taylor, and one of them is missing, and as of the latest I heard, had not been recovered yet. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Howie, that's the latest that I've heard as well. I hadn't seen anything online, so I reached out to a friend who lives in the area. She works for Jackson Hole Mountain Guides. And the latest that she could share around 11 o'clock Eastern time was that the Teton Search and Rescue and the Jackson Ski Patrol are still out looking. So yeah, that's the latest that I've heard, unfortunately.
And this is on the heels of, 11 skier-triggered avalanches in the Wasatch and the North Wasatch over the weekend?
Exactly, yeah. It's been pretty striking and alarming to see these numbers roll in. But the Utah Avalanche Center reported 11 human-triggered slides over the weekend. New Hampshire's been seeing a lot of not slides, but a lot of people congregating. We just wrote a piece on our website yesterday. Tyler Cohen put it together about some recent closures in the area. Brian, I'm sure you can speak more to it as well. But the U.S. Forest Service actually closed down the Cutler River drainage. So that's Tuckerman Ravine, Huntington Ravine, and then the Gulf of Sides as well too. So a lot of craziness out there. Brian, it's been pretty wild to keep up with.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. Brian, were you at Pinkham Notch over the weekend? And if so, what did you see?
I spun by to do a quick assessment and kind of just from my car, but the parking lot had approximately 400 cars in the parking lot. Many of those cars carried multiple occupants, and there was a sort of a festive atmosphere there. It was very, very crowded. Everybody forced through, a few different keyholes really to get up to the ravine. The first keyhole being the trailhead, and then the pinch by the courtyard of front the Forest Service cabin, and then connection cache. The trail is very narrow in these places. Social distancing is really not realistic. But even if it was realistic, at the wider parts of the trail, it wasn't being observed by anybody. And unfortunately, the decision had to be made in the interest of the public health to close down. First to suspend forecasting so as to not send the message that the governor's order to only leave for essential needs didn't apply to backcountry skiers. And then subsequently, the decision was made to close the lee aspect of the mountain. There was one rescue that day. A gentleman got cliffed out and called 911, needed to be belayed down, and only later disclosed that he was an EMT who had visited from New Jersey, and he worked in a hospital that had active COVID patients. So I think the decision was the right one, and I don't think there was another choice.
Right. So people clearly aren't getting the message. We've seen a bunch of efforts on social media to try to, reduce or eliminate people getting out there into difficult situations. I know we've all had these conversations with our friends about, what's cool and what's not cool. A friend from California said, if you've got to put a beacon on, you shouldn't be out. There are many that feel like you shouldn't be skinning at a resort, even if it's in your own town and you're driving by yourself 4 miles up the road. Nick, you guys have, SIA have started an effort, Curb Your Turns. Tell us why you felt that was important for SIA to be leading on, and what are what have you noticed with it?
Yeah, thanks. So we noticed a huge number of social postings based around backcountry skiing and people getting outside. Our first job is not to dissuade people from getting outside. Our primary base of business is to help the industry thrive. That includes getting outside as much as possible. But for us to get back outside, we need to curb your turns. And as I mentioned, we've seen a lot of social postings on Instagram and Facebook, people enjoying the outdoors and really promoting their activity and their lack of social distancing. We felt it was necessary to create this hashtag and this campaign to dissuade people from continuing to participate in winter sports, helping to flatten that curve and do their part in staying at home. And we've had a lot of other of our members and individuals jump on the bandwagon in creating very similar programs, whether it's Burton Stay at Home or just other stay at home campaigns that are populating right now.
Heather, what are you noticing in Washington State? You guys were obviously the hotbed of this from the beginning. Earlier, before we were cut off, Lucy was talking about one of our contributors who was, I believe, on that trip to BC where there were 8 of them and several of them got sick. What are you noticing in your zone?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely hearing from friends in the Leavenworth area, in the Methow Valley, and kind of these tourism hotspots that they're being overrun by people And, I'm in Seattle, and we had one of the first outbreaks in the country. And so we were a little bit ahead of the curve of trying to get people socially distant and working from home. And I think there was a flood out of the city. People who are mountain people, I think, want to be in the mountains. There's kind of this like psychological connection. So I think being forced to stay at home is a tricky thing to balance. And I can just say anecdotally for me, what ended up being kind of my last tour of the year, I went out, it was right after we had our first cases in Seattle, and I kind of went out for what I thought was like a mellow, like an exercise ski, basically, like low angle, terrain that I wasn't worried about. And I ended up taking a really bad fall. The light was flat, and I just hit a drop off weird and slammed myself, and had this realization where I was like, oh, I think I did something to my wrist, but I really don't want to be going to the emergency room right now. And that for me really hit home about like, now as we have to calculate risk really differently right now, and not try and burden the system when it's already overloaded. And I think that, things that might feel really sort of normal and, within our range right now kind of aren't. So that's been kind of a wake up call for me to be like, okay, what are we really, if this is really a kind of broad scale public health thing, we all need to be responsible for it, and not, even if something like Tux feels like in your backyard and normal, maybe now is not the time to really be pushing it.
Right.
So I think like socially and personally, that's kind of been ringing home for me.
Right. Brian, of those 400 cars in the parking lot at Pinkham Notch, I heard obviously many of them were from out of state. And I know that
roughly 50% were from out of state. There is sort of there's a polarization in the Mount Washington Valley now because there is growing dissension against those who are visiting from out of state. I don't think that's appropriate. These are second homeowners, they contribute to our tax base, they're part of our community and they're people. The problem is that when visiting our area, the notion of social distancing and self-isolation seem to evaporate. There was almost an atmosphere of I'm on vacation at my vacation home.
Sure.
And, it's particularly worrisome, not only because of the exposure of potential rescuers and the exposure of these patients to the emergency room setting, but, there was data released last evening to suggest that the mode of transmission of coronavirus is potentially aerosolized. So a 6-foot radius doesn't really protect you. I think we're learning that it actually can hang in the air for an undetermined period of time and fill an entire room. So we're dealing with a monster that seems to be a lot larger, and I think that wasn't really understood by a lot of these folks.
Yeah, of course, here in Vermont, we're seeing that as well, and it's a challenge, right? It's almost like we need a social media campaign about not going to your second home, but it is as you said, I mean, this is their property and this is their place, and it's just such a complex and fluid situation. Heather, you're working on a book, and you recently wrote a story for Backcountry magazine about the mental health impacts on, in particular, for the story you worked on for us, of the rescue community patrol, mountain rescue, and what were some of your key takeaways from that research, and how might you apply what you've learned to this situation?
Yeah, that's like a good big question, I think. And just for a little context, the book is about sort of the sustainability of skiing and ski bums in every capacity. So like economically, climate change. And one of the big things that has been the most interesting thing to research for me has been mental health. And that is, high rates of suicide in ski towns. That's us pushing it and getting into situations like Lucy was talking about earlier, where there's 11 slides in a day. And kind of that need to be out and pushing it, and also what the repercussions are for that. And one of the most interesting parts in that has been sort of like the background psychology. And there's research about what they call sensation seeking, which is basically one of the main personality. There's 5 big personality traits, and people who are, the kind of people who are going to commit to being lifties or ski patrollers or search and rescue or guides often have higher bars for sensation seeking, and so they need more stimulation than other people might. This guy, Ryan Burke, who's a counselor in Jackson, told me that, you know, a normal person can go to Disneyland and have a good time. And these people who have really, you know, athletes and people who have really high bars for sensation seeking, he said they have to go to Disneyland on meth to get the same high. So that means that people in our community, which is maybe an extreme version, but that means that people in our community often have this kind of inbound sense of like needing to be outside, needing to be, you know, be getting an adrenaline rush. And that's really hard, I think, right now, when we're all, for the good of everybody, we're all sitting in our living rooms, staring at each other over Zoom, not getting out, not getting those rushes. So I think this is actually like, this is a hard time for everybody. But I think if you do have that kind of like, your brain is gauged a certain way, now is really hard for people, I guess. And I think that, getting to what Brian was saying about people still pushing it, it's hard to kind of dial it back. And one of the other common traits of, you know, among people is what they call antisocial behavior, which means that you don't play by the rules very well. It's not that you don't like people, it's just that you're like, if somebody tells you what to do, you're gonna not just take that at face value. And I think that's another kind of common trait that's really tricky right now. When we're getting these, I mean, nationally and state level, we're getting these kind of complicated directives about stay at home or shelter in place or whatever that means. And if you're somebody who innately is not great at following directions, that might be even harder for you.
Right.
So not to excuse it, but just to give a little context.
Sure. So the stay at home effort is an absolute, right? It's pretty simple. Stay at home. Don't do anything that isn't outside your absolute baseline of existence. You know, go to the store, whatever, to sustain your family. Is that appropriate, or should the messaging be something more nuanced? Like, is it a spectrum, or what is it? This is something I've struggled to find out there in the messaging. You know, frankly, I feel our governor here in Vermont has done a good job with his messaging. He's been very, very solid. We're not necessarily seeing that in other states. Brian, I mean, Nick, Lucy, and I are here in Vermont, so we're getting that same message. Nick, you obviously live in Utah part of the year, as I understand it. What are the three of you seeing from your leaders about staying at home? Brian, I'll start with you.
Well, Sununu, Governor Sununu issued his stay-at-home order on March 25th, and the order was it was to stay at home for everything except for essential needs. But in the same press conference, he emphasized the importance of getting recreation and getting outside and enjoying the Granite State. He stopped short of recommending that those recreation outlets should be close to home and be done conservatively. And I think that mixed message really did confuse a lot of people, because our governor basically went so far as to say, get outside if you can socially distance. Now, this flew in the face of a lot of media coverage of congested trailheads. There's a hiking trail down by Lake Winnipesaukee. There were 1,000 cars there right after he put this out, and he's not clarified this to date. So I think there's room for more public education about how serious this is, and perhaps we could really help people understand better if he were to emphasize conservation and staying close to home.
Nick, what are you observing in Utah and Vermont?
I mean, much like Brian mentioned, there still is a lot of education that has to happen around what it means to get outside, what it means to stay at home, what does it mean to be shelter in place, what is essential versus not essential, and how does that relate to recreation? And we're seeing a ton of recreation in Utah, in and around the Wasatch. I think that's indicative of those avalanches you mentioned earlier. I think that the social posting that we're seeing in and around closed resorts and a lot of the backcountry hubs appear to be all time. I mean, which is worrisome, and then the same goes for Vermont. Stowe closed there, Stowe Mountain Resort closed there the mountain for skinning. My understanding is there was over 250 cars in the parking lot Saturday, and the bulk of those people skinning were skinning on 2 trails. Snow's an expensive resort. It's just mind-boggling to me why the population feel it's necessary to get out and participate together. But in both states, there's room for interpretation. And as we have been discussing, people that are very experienced in the backcountry, very, very experienced in an alpine environment, we are telling them what they don't want to hear. And they're going to challenge that. And so we have to be very clear in how we communicate to the very novice and the very extreme.
Right. So, and that is the challenge, right? We face that all the time in media. How do you reach a wide breadth of the community? What are you suggesting? And have you followed up with the Curb Your Turns effort with any more nuanced messaging? As like, go for a walk, go for a hike, right? Are we riding bikes? Is it, is it cool to be out on a road bike right now? If you have a flat tire, you got to get a ride. I mean, there's so much to it.
There's so much to it. And, the messaging is simple. Stay at home. If you need to go for a walk, go for a walk. If you need to go for a run, go for a run. I live in a rural part of Vermont. I can go for a run and not see a person for 5 miles. And I know that's not the same for everyone. But, if we can do our part today, it's only going to get us back on our bike for the next season sooner. And if I'd hate to lose the tail end of the winter sports season and then lose mountain biking season, that would be a double whammy.
Right.
It's very simple. Stay at home.
Right.
Get off the social media, and if you have to recreate in a place that is away from population.
Heather, what are you seeing up there in Washington as far as the messaging goes? Again, you guys were frontline in this. How do you feel your governor's dealt with it, and what is some of the messaging coming from your leaders?
I think the messaging has largely been pretty similar, but like you said, we had some of the first outbreaks, and then Governor Inslee didn't issue the stay-at-home order until I think it was the 23rd of March. So it took a little while, I think, because like Brian was saying, the information has kind of been rolling and the education has been ongoing, and it's been kind of hard to tell what exactly the right thing to do is. And then once he issued that stay-at-home order, he explicitly said when he gave the order that people could still go for walks, and then he's been kind of amending it as in the last week or so to kind of clarify which businesses are still allowed to be open, what counts as essential. So I think one of the hard parts is that we are kind of on this learning curve of what, like Nick said, stay at home is sort of the baseline, but I think that means that is such a sort of like loose phrasing that it's sort of hard. You're like, should I just be going for a walk within my neighborhood? Is it okay if I go for a 10-mile run all across the city? There's a park, big lake about 3/4 of a mile from my house, which is kind of my normal go up there and run around daily run. And it's been more jammed than I've ever seen it before. I think all of a sudden now that people are, especially in a city, more contained, your outlets are really limited. And so everyone's kind of antsy. And I think about this for myself. It's hard to want to tell people to not do what I want to do.
Right.
So I think it's a tricky line of like, how do we stop ourselves from going crazy? It's like people need to be outside. We need sunshine. Like, how do you not, if we're going to be in this for a while, which it increasingly seems like we're going to be, how do you keep people safe and healthy in every capacity? I think that's, maybe Brian can speak to that, but that's like a tricky question when the facts are unfolding in front of us. It's a hard thing. I mean, from a journalistic standpoint, it's a really hard thing to report on because it's changing all the time.
Right. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, I think she raises an important point, which is that, from a mental health standpoint, outdoor recreation is core to so many of us. And it's such a part of our lives, and it's such an important facet of how we, sort of shake off the dust and really keep our mental health, clear. Unfortunately, in this time, I think we don't have, an option other than to find other avenues. It's a time when we're forced to adapt, and we all have to do things that we don't like. And this is wartime. And unfortunately, we have to behave like we're at war. And, I think that if you have, skin laps in your backyard, like some friends in Vermont do, conservatively, perhaps that's not terribly inappropriate, but you always have to think about the caveat of an accident. I ski patrol, and I've pulled some of the best skiers, out of, lift tower wells and in the trees. So anything can happen. I think it's a time to really emphasize conservation and finding another way to be more of an armchair skier, at least until this passes.
Right. So one of the things that struck me is we've seen this explosion. Certainly early on in this, we saw this explosion in backcountry skiing. We'll just call it that. Trailhead usage, etc. And one of the things that struck me is, were all of these folks typically riding a chair? Certainly, to some extent, that's the case. And we've seen, backcountry equipment sales boomed early on in this. A lot of the retailers we knew before they shut down were selling a ton of stuff. I don't know where that stands now, but I was like, personally, like, who are these people? And I'm also wondering if, and it's easy to take a broad sweep at this, but are we seeing not only the volume, but a great percentage of that volume is much less educated in backcountry travel? The fact that we had 11 skier triggered avalanches in one weekend in the Wasatch and the North Wasatch, that's a high number during normal times. Mm-hmm. So we have to be seeing a great deal of people that really don't know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Would anybody care to comment on that?
I'll take a stab at a few of those topics. The last few years we've seen significant spike in backcountry product, backcountry activity, and backcountry participation. That can be contributed to a number of factors. One is population's desire to get further away from people, especially in this culture of multiple screen life that we live in. I think with the results in the data that we're producing, the multi-mountain pass, the number of people that are at resort, or the issues to even get to the resort through traffic and parking and whatnot. The multi-mountain passes have really exposed the weakness areas, the weakest areas in communities and resorts. Just getting out of your hotel or your house to the mountain. Once you're on the mountain, you can be distributed. There's plenty of lifts to do that. But going back to this, this interest of backcountry, it's on the rise. We're seeing it in the number of product that are sold, skis, boots, bindings, and same goes for beacons, shovels, backpacks, probes, whatnot. The real issue that we are now faced with are the people who have adapted to uphill and backcountry, and have the training are out there, and they're really glamorizing the category, and the people who are just getting into it do not have that training, that experience to help make good decisions in those environments. And that's where I go back to the earlier comment. If we can stop glamorizing and socializing a lot of these images in your own selfish experiences, that will have a lasting effect.
Right. And
I agree with you. Oh,
go ahead, Lou.
I was just going to add on to that. I completely agree with you, Nick. And then when you couple this spike of backcountry sales, which has been going on for a few years, with a very sudden, definitive end to resort skiing. And I know many of those people who are new to backcountry skiing or recently bought a AT setup. Their version of backcountry skiing is to head up, the resort's uphill lane before they go to work or something. So when that's off the table, then they head to the nearest trailhead. And I think that's been a huge issue.
I think the social media stuff plays into it too. And it's kind of like we're all of a sudden living in a world where the only feedback we get is through other people's screens. So you're seeing, I mean, even like you look at like everyone and their mom is like baking sourdough now. Like everyone sort of is like trying to find this novel thing to do while they're cooped up at home. And I think like you flip through Instagram and you see Cody Townsend or whoever, like skiing. And I think he's actually been good about curbing it. But I think there's this kind of, your brain does this thing where it's like, oh, everybody else is doing that. I should be doing that too. And it's really hard to turn that off when that's the only social outlet you have right now.
I mean, I believe that there's, a significant heuristic trap, mentality here. We're seeing expert halo. We're seeing familiarity. We're seeing some of the other facets of these heuristic traps that get people into trouble or get their groups into trouble, whether it's avalanche terrain or whatever. But now the ramifications are to the greater public. And really the same concepts hold true. It's people, falling into those same patterns and, go with the herd, and it must be safe because everyone else goes to Tux, or I've been there before. And, unfortunately it's put us in this position.
Nick, let's talk a little bit about we're going to change gears here real quick and talk a little bit about the business side of this. Obviously, we're all in the ski industry on some level. What are some of your members thinking about right now? What are they doing? What are you seeing?
Well, we're seeing a lot, and like we've mentioned during this time together, everything is changing so quickly. I just read last night that Vail Resorts is going to furlough all of their hourly employees, and the resort business is looking to lose billions of dollars in the next couple of months. And for an industry that has been very stable, relatively speaking, from the resort community, they're taking a big hit. From a retailer perspective, we're in this area of uncertainty and unknown, no differently than everyone else. The season was cut short. Retailers have closed their doors. They're missing this last 4 weeks of the season where they typically unload a bulk of their product at discount. And that period of time plays into the bigger picture of the retailer ordering product for next year, or if they have ordered product for next year, looking to reduce that order, which is in return going to hurt the retailer in the fall and in the winter. We're seeing a lot of manufacturers starting to curb their manufacturing to accommodate for these orders being trimmed down. We're also seeing a lot of suppliers looking at their overhead and wondering if they're going to need to furlough some employees or make some headcount adjustments. None of this is good for the industry, and this is something that we're all looking at and we're monitoring. We've seen a lot of events, seminars, trade shows, buying groups make changes or cancel their events as well. So it's gonna put a lot of pressure on the business to rethink the way that they're operating and the way that they're working with their retailers. It's going to create a lot of opportunity for that supplier manufacturer, reassess how they do that business. So we're going to see a lot of change in the coming months. Some might not be welcome. Some might be very strategic to align the business for the future.
As I look at the ski industry and I think about the window in which we operate, we almost made it right before this crisis. That's not the same as the cycling industry, which, we publish a mountain bike magazine as well. And, so part of me is thankful for the timing. If this had hit us in October or November
or January,
it would have been
or January,
right? It would have been curtains.
Yeah.
So, are you similarly thankful for the timing, or is there any gem here? Is there anything that gives you any peace, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I guess it's fair to say we're thankful it's not January or earlier, if you have to find the silver lining. Right. I think more importantly, our industry has been run the same way for the last 30 and 40 years, and I look at the silver lining as this really gives us the ability to look at how we want to run this industry for the next 20 to 30 years. And this is the only time in my career we've pumped the brakes on everything and reassessed and realigned. And so I'm urging our members to do the same and really think about how they want to run their business and what they want to look like in the short, mid, and long term.
Right. Brian, let's talk a little bit about your life, your personal life outside of the ski world. How has this impacted your practice? What are you seeing over there?
Well, my practice is it's a freestanding family practice and travel clinic. There's nobody traveling anymore. But in terms of my my outpatient panel, what we're doing is trying to keep anybody who's febrile out of the office. If they have a fever and they show up, they get scanned at the door, and I assess them in their car. Do a strep test or a flu test in their vehicle. And then we have multiple levels of a clinic set up, one at the hospital for febrile patients, and then a drive-through COVID testing clinic. It's been interesting. It's been busy. I think this is the calm before the storm for sure. We're really expecting this to spike in the next month or so. In terms of, I'm just doing a lot of writing and sitting at home. I haven't seen my kids in about a month because they're tucked away safely, and hopefully that won't last forever. But we just get through. We have a great team, and I think that given the fact that it hasn't really spiked in the Granite State yet, we are fortunate that we have preparation time for surge control, acquisition of ventilators, and so forth. So,
right, Heather, you're a freelancer. We're a media company. Obviously, we've got concerns about, to Nick's point, the marketing budgets are often the first thing to go. So there's a lot of concern there. What are you seeing out there with some of your outlets? Have you been speaking a lot with other freelancers or publishers?
Yeah, sure. It does feel, on some level, being a freelancer feels safer than having a job where I could be furloughed or something like that, because I have multiple outlets. But I've had almost everywhere that I work for that I'm working on stuff now, I've had stuff pushed back or canceled, or I have some contract stuff that's been shrunk down because advertisers are pulling out. Because I think, like, speaking to Nick's point, brands aren't sure what their income is going to be like. So then they're not necessarily, you guys can probably speak to this too, that then they're pulling back ad buys. And I know you guys are a little bit insulated because it's seasonal, but I think everybody is sort of in this, precarious point where we're not sure how long this is going to go on for. We're not sure how long the economy is going to be shut down for. And that's definitely, trickling down into media. And, this is obviously the hill that I would die on, but right now it feels like news and media is the most important. People need to get information, people need to know what's going on. And that's getting sort of hammered right at the time when people need it the most. So that definitely feels scary to me for my kind of personal outlook, and sort of more like big picture for the state of the world and getting information. Right. But yeah, I think there's definitely, there's big picture changes happening, and it is for sure starting to trickle down.
Right.
So I go through like the emotional roller coaster. Sometimes I feel fine. Sometimes I feel really scared.
I'm down to on my calendar, good days and bad, trying to keep it at 60% through this, whereas normally it might be a lot higher. Lou, how about yourself? What are you feeling out there? Lose froze?
It's definitely, it's strange. What's that? Oh, yeah. No, it feels a little uncertain for sure. I feel like you were saying, Howie, pretty grateful that we're in what is sort of our off season. What we're covering is largely online and gearing up for a print season that doesn't, go out to the masses until September. So at this point, that feels like a bit of a safety net for us. But it's uncertain, definitely. Hanging in there.
Yeah. Well, I guess we all have a plan B, and we're doing our best to execute on it. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Please stay well and healthy, and stay off the mountain. And we'll hope to see you next time we see one another. It'll be on the white stuff. So take care. The Backcountry podcast is produced by Backcountry Magazine, an imprint of Height of Land Publications in Jeffersonville, Vermont. Lucy Higgins is our editor-in-chief. Our intro music was composed by Alex Paul. Additional thanks to Paula Wright, Tyler Cohen, Louise Lintelak, Mike Lorenz, Robin Earl, Paul Davis, Justin Ryer, Michelle Peoples, Holly Howard, and Karen Heward. I'm Adam Howard. Until next time, I'll see you in the hills. Thanks for listening.